They are observing things out there. They're building up an understanding of these things so that they can act to achieve their goals. All of these things already exist.
I think you can adopt a materialist view of the world, which is that everything is made of material bits, and try and account for everything in that framework. It's a very powerful model. It's one that I would want to use myself in lots of circumstances, but it's a model. It's not a description of what's going on out there. You can apply a biological model and have an account of how we're making sense of human evolution, or evolution generally, in the context of our current understandings in terms of cells and DNA and so forth. These are ways of trying to make sense of the world. The issue about consciousness is a more puzzling level, which is this point that I was trying to make at the beginning about the difference between the observer and the observed. That there's something about the nature of experience that requires an observer and an observed, and you just can't find the observer in the observed. It undermines the idea of what you've got there in the first place. So I agree in a way with what Sabine was saying, and I have wondered whether in the sort of framework that I put forward, whether you could generate a machine which will approximate to subjectivity. And I agree that you would have to find something that somehow tries to identify the observer in its way, identifying it as its way of holding a world which is something other. And in principle, I think maybe that is possible, but we're certainly nowhere near there at the moment. And I think that we have to engage in this fundamental question that there's something different about the character of experience than there is about material bits. And that model is always going to fail if it tries to extend it into experience.
So I would describe myself as a materialist, and that's going to be offensive to some people. But what I mean by materialism includes all the physics. It includes everything that we think we know about the universe. I'm saying we have 1 billion reactions a second in a single bacterial cell. How do you take stock of all of those things? I personally think that we're dealing with electromagnetic fields as a way of organizing that information. We're already getting beyond some people's view of what materialism is, but we're dealing with physics here. We're dealing with forces that we know about.
Yoshua, you've got a point.
Yeah. So I'm going to step back a little bit. Because I think what Hilary said shocks me. Scientific theories are, never sure that they're correct. Mathematical theories, you might, and so they're models of how things work. And what matters for science is how good are these theories at predicting what we observe. And we do observe a whole lot of things about consciousness, but of course, no scientific theory can be 100% sure that this is what's going on. And so I think we should not, discard, that this principle of, which is basically reason behind how science works, could apply to consciousness. And let me add one more thing. The way you're talking, Hilary, I could just change your words. And you could be talking about God. You could be talking about magic. You could be talking about something non-material, which, of course, by some kind of definition, would be forever, not accessible to science. But if you go back to the philosophy of science, these are meaningless statements because they can never be tested. And from a mathematical perspective, you can say that they're useless.
Yeah, and absolutely, I would agree with you. Of course, we have to be able to test our accounts, and that's how we improve them. So the point that I've been making is not that trying to point to the limitation of models is not to say that we shouldn't be trying to improve them and make them more effective. And indeed, as far as my own work is concerned, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is trying to make a more effective model, which I would describe as a closure within my framework. Now, so of course we should be trying to do that. but I think there are limitations to what you can do with a model that will be, as it were, always outside of that framework. And the materialist framework, I think, has squashed the universe. It's a monist story. There's one thing in the world, it's material, and there's a problem that experience, by definition, is not one thing. It requires two things. It requires the observer and the observed. Otherwise, you don't have experience. Otherwise, you're like a stone. You need that relationship. And you've got to get that relationship back if materialism was going to be successful in trying to make an account of either thought or experience.
I have to respond to this. So the story about observer and observed is, meaningless if you go and look at what AI is doing. We are building agents. So these are like computer programs that act in the world, perform computation, have an internal state, evolves with what they're seeing, and have goals, which basically correspond to intentions. And they are observing things out there. They're building up an understanding of these things so that they can act to achieve their goals. All of these things already exist. Now, not at the level of human intelligence, but the idea that because there is an observer and an observed, it can't be reproduced in a material way, that doesn't make any sense. Because we already do that for like simpler systems, and there's nothing magic there.
Yoshua, can I ask, sorry, just to dive in there. So it seems to me that we're talking about this subjective experience aspect, right? So my question to you would be, okay, so they are already doing that, but how do you test for a subjective experience? How do you consult something like this and say, are you aware of what you're doing? It seems to me that that's the problem in this context, because we can test for computation because we can look for inputs and outputs, but it's the subjective experience part that we seem to be struggling with. So
Okay, so I can tell you more about the theory that I believe the most in regarding subjective experience. It's basically saying that when we become conscious and have a subjective experience, what happens is something we observe in the neurobiology, which is that the activity of neurons in the brain converges towards fixed points. There's special configurations of the brain that would be attractive. In other words, wherever you start from in some neighborhood, you would reach these points. And it turns out that when you study, and this is just observing the activity of neurons when you're becoming conscious of something, and if you think carefully about what that means, you can deduce the properties that I mentioned earlier that are associated with subjective experience, namely ineffability, richness of the experience, fleetingness of the experience, and the fact that it's personal and unique to you. All of these can be deduced from that model. Now, this is just a theory, but the way science works is like this, right? So we have observations. I mentioned like 4 properties of subjective experience. That doesn't mean that if I have a theory that explains these things, that it is the correct theory. But that's how science works. We're going to come up with theories, and we're going to test them. So here, I didn't test that theory. I just somehow made up a theory that fits the data, but there will be more data. There will be, once we have a theory, you can test it in the field. And the nice thing about the advances in brain sciences in the last few decades is that we can now look into your brain, or animal brains or human brains. It's harder, but we can, and so we can test different theories in ways that are very different, but then just having a philosopher's discussion about what may be going on in our minds.
I mean, I think the issue here is that is what was being called the neural correlates of consciousness, going back to Crick really in the early 1990s, that if we are able to figure out, okay, this particular pattern of neural networks firing is associated with a conscious experience and this one isn't, and so we can then somehow piece it together and figure out, okay, here's the answer to consciousness. But we've really got nowhere down that line. And a year or two ago, Christoph Koch had a bet with David Chalmers 25 years ago for a case of wine about whether we would be closer to understanding conscious experience. And Christoph Koch gave the case of wine to David Chalmers. I think it's the wrong level of analysis. We cannot work out why this neural net would be conscious and this one is not. We have and this is why we have a problem if we want to look. I know you're conscious. Why do I know you're conscious? Because you behave a bit like I do, and everything that I know about you it says you're conscious. I'm pretty certain a dog is conscious. I have no problem interpreting its behavior in that way. Are bees conscious? I would say yes, they are, but not in a way that I'm familiar with. What about bacteria? Now, most biologists would back away from me at this point and say, you're being stupid. At least there's got to be some kind of a nervous system. But the problem is that we don't have a test that says, okay, this is what you measure if you want to measure a conscious state. And I think that the neural net is simply the wrong level of analysis to understand what is conscious or what is not.
So I agree with, of course, the things you say. Other than that, I don't think there is a right answer to that. Because we get better models. And as I say, I myself, as it were, trying to frame a model which might work better and might enable us to build more intelligent machines. But I think we're not going to solve that puzzle for the logical reason that I've identified about experience. Experience, it requires two levels. Descartes thought it was mind and body. Other people have talked about language and the world. Some people have described it as the observer and the observed. But I think that structural relationship of two parts is somehow necessary in consciousness and experience, and you're not going to find it in a model which has somehow tried to flatten the world into one level. You're not going to be able to find it.
But you could structure models that have the two levels you want, and that's easy.
I agree. Well, then that would be interesting to see how that model might operate. And I agree, which is why when Sabine was saying the same thing, maybe there's a way in which you could frame how a machine could somehow take account of itself, create, in my terminology, its own closure of itself, and perhaps you might then be able to begin to frame something that is something a little bit more like consciousness, but we are a very, very long way from anything like that.
If I may, I'm struck by the fact that when you were just talking, Nick, I thought to myself, how do you know when something is conscious? How do we in this room know? How do all of you sat there know that we are conscious? We must be exhibiting something that indicates that. And just because something can mimic that doesn't mean that it is. I mean, I don't know about you probably didn't do this, but the first time I interacted with ChatGPT, for example, it's so accurate at mimicking human interaction. I found myself reacting emotionally. I was like, why, thank you, ChatGPT. All of this sort of stuff. And then I thought to myself, in that situation, this is what this conversation is about, right? It's about whether or not a computer based in silicon, communicating through the internet via a screen to me, does enough to emulate something that triggers my brain into thinking, okay, well, this thing seems conscious. Does that make it conscious or does that not make it conscious? And is that sufficient or insufficient? And if
does anyone
why?
in this room think that ChatGPT is already conscious?
Right, but why? Why do we?
A lot of surveys about this, which I've had a close eye on, and there is a significant part of people who actually do think that ChatGPT is conscious on a low level. Mm-hmm. Like it's in the percent range or something like that. So it's not just crazy people.
No, only one hand went up here and he was smiling.
Thanks for making me feel better. I'm the one who just admitted that I felt weak.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's true. Someone sent me an email a while ago with some other program and said, this is an amazingly different level compared to ChatGPT and feedback, and he's conscious. And I read through, and it was pretty impressive. But you read, okay, what's it actually said here? And it's just words put together. That's all it is.
But this, I think, really does touch upon the thing that makes it uncomfortable, right? On one hand, we're saying, as human beings, we can recognize consciousness when we're faced with it. And on the other hand, it seems very evident that we can't. So, yes, Yoshua.
Yes, I'm going to follow up on that, Red.
Please.
Whether we end up with a satisfying scientific theory of consciousness or not, or a satisfying test, I think an important issue is humans will attribute consciousness if we have an entity that displays a lot of the human-like properties that we associate with consciousness, and then that has consequences. That has social consequences. We may be tempted once enough people think that some machines have consciousness, to give them moral rights. And I think that is a very dangerous proposition. We could end up with machines that we consider like, our peers, and give them, even design them so that they have their own self-preservation goals, just like every living thing has. And that would be dangerous for humanity. If there are machines that are smarter than us, and in the future, obviously, and that have their own self-preservation goal, then humanity is in danger. So I think we should be careful before we get there. But it's going to be very tempting for most people because, we naturally see consciousness, whether it's there or not. Forget about the definition. But that's how people feel when we interact with entities that look and behave like conscious things we already know.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, of course, because exactly, right? There's this question of whether or not they are or aren't conscious. And then there's the question of what do you do once you establish they are? And I think the parallel...
It might not be a scientific kind of decision. Evidently. It might be just a psychological thing that we have a natural tendency to project ourselves and, our model of ourselves into others. And by the way, this is part of, for example, Gordiano's theory of attention schema for consciousness. And so we will naturally do that if there are, machines that behave in a way that trigger the same like mirror neurons that make us model that as another human-like.
I mean, the parallel, of course, is, currently we're talking about computers, but if we switch examples, the moral implications become very evident. For example, if we think about animals, right? The moment we start to see signs of consciousness in animals, and if you think about it for a certain amount of time, the sort of moral responsibility you feel towards these organisms changes quite substantially. And I think that's what you're saying here, isn't it, Yoshua?
Yeah.
This comes back round to the hard problem and what feelings are, and the morality as far as animals are concerned is how much pain and suffering do we cause, and we have no way of knowing. We can see it in the eyes of animals that they appear to be suffering. Are they really? Who could say? Now, the other way round, I would say they definitely are, for clarity. But the other way round, probably a lot of people in this room would have seen Ex Machina, and this ambiguity at the end. How much is she simply using him to get her ends? How much is she emotionally engaged in any of it? It's really, really deeply ambiguous, beautifully done. And I can imagine at least that AI is probably there already for all I know, perfectly capable of manipulating us emotionally without necessarily having any feelings behind it. So the morality boils down to the feelings, and we have no way of quantifying them or measuring them.
Can a computer have feelings? Is that kind of part of the fear of this thing, I guess, right? Is that
there's no reason why it couldn't be the case.
Why it couldn't or could?
No, there's no reason why it couldn't be the case that computers have feelings. I think since we designed them, and to avoid this moral danger, we should not give them the same kinds of feelings as we do. But there are some people who argue that as soon as you have AI agents that have goals and get basically rewards for achieving their goals, some primitive feelings are already there, because feelings can be interpreted as anticipation of success or failure, dying or getting what you want, what you need. So it's tricky, and we need to be very careful and do a lot more research to understand these things before we build them and just see what happens, like apprentice sorcerers.
Sabine, you were about to say something.
I've tried, yeah. So I wanted to come back to this question of the Turing test that we started from, because I feel like there was a point that we kind of jumped over, which hasn't been clearly stated. So I don't think that consciousness or even experience is something that you can infer from the outside. Like the Turing test is basically you feed something into the system and you look at what comes out. Or if you look at some, thought experiments that philosophers like to talk about, like the Chinese room, or philosophical zombies and all that kind of stuff, it's about what you can infer from what you put in and what comes out. Where I think, and this is also what most of the mathematical models try to get at, that it's a property of what happens inside the system. So if you want to know whether an AI is conscious, you need to look at what's going on inside the system, what's happening in the code, what is it actually doing? And there's no amount of questioning that will ever settle that question, exactly because of this philosophical zombie problem. And so I totally agree with you, by the way, that if you're talking about experience or consciousness, it's always experience of something, or you have to be conscious of something. But I see no reason why you can't quantify this mathematically. And so I think the property that you're looking for with the observer observing themselves is basically a type of self-similarity, which is mathematically very well defined. So that's the question, like, is the neural net actually the right basis to use to look for that kind of thing? I don't know.
But also, surely if the substrate is so different, there's a fundamental problem here. We learn about consciousness and we build our models looking at biological organisms and that give us biological signs of consciousness. Is there not a fundamental possibility that we can't use those same rules to look for consciousness in a computational model because it uses a different substrate? Is that...
No, you can simulate stochastic differential equations in a computer. So in principle, there's no hard separation between what a computer can do and what biology can do.
But look, I think this. I think they're just. I agree with Sabine that looking inside, as it were, the observer, if you can create an observer, might enable you to get to a point where you've identified that as being something akin to consciousness. Maybe interesting further conversation. But I'd just like to go back to that first point that I made about this idea of imitation, which is the one that Turing introduces, that he wants to replace the word thinking with the idea that a machine imitates a human activity, and that if it imitates a human activity as well as we do, then it could be said to think. That's his definition. And I think this is just a mistake. And the example I gave was the mousetrap. The mousetrap kills a mice better than we do. We don't then conclude that the mousetrap thinks. That's self-evidently not a move you can make. You can't move from function to saying there is something going on which is thought. They're different sorts of things. And when it looks as if it's plausible, because he introduces the idea of language, and we imagine the computer has understood words. It understands nothing. It doesn't understand. It is simply responding in ways that we have programmed very cleverly to respond in ways which do replicate what we do. It doesn't then mean that it has something else altogether.
Yoshua,
I need to react to the question of understanding. It's a debated issue, of course, and we don't even have a clear definition of what it means. But the AI researchers, computer scientists who are designing these AI systems, instead of using the word understanding, they talk about the ability of a system to make sense of the world, and that can be tested, quantified by how well it predicts what would happen or acts in a way that achieves goals. This is quantifiable. And in order to understand our intuition about understanding, you'd like these predictions to work in new settings, right? So otherwise, it's just like a big table that repeats the things that it has seen. But now there's enough scientific evidence for things like ChatGPT, GPT-4 in particular, that these systems can generalize, can make good predictions way outside of the data they're being trained on. There are ways, like statistical ways, to create question and answers for these systems that guarantee that it couldn't have seen those questions. And so it's not just repeating the things that it has seen, but it's making correct predictions. And in order to make correct predictions, it needs to understand enough about the subject matter in order to make those correct predictions. So the scientific evidence towards, a notion of understanding, which admittedly is fuzzy, is pointing more and more in the direction that these systems, the ones at state of the art right now, they are understanding.
But I'm not clear, Yoshua. You wouldn't say that of a mousetrap. It can catch mice better than you can. You don't think, it's doing this really well, so it must be experiencing catching the mice. It does it very well. It's a function it does better than we do. But that doesn't mean that we then conclude it's understanding.
The mousetrap always does the same thing. Your brain, my brain, and the machines have some sort of model that allows us to predict correctly the outcomes of things. So what is science doing? Science is doing the same thing. Science is building models that allows us to make good predictions and then act accordingly. And that is the scientific understanding. And you have exactly the same mathematical property in those systems. They build some sort of model. I mean, not necessarily in the same same way that we do in physics, but it still has the same properties of good prediction power in completely new settings. And that is not the same thing as the mousetrap story, not at all. It's about what people in machine learning call generalization. In other words, the ability to go from the experience you had in the past and predict correctly in new settings.
Dick.
I think one of the directions that neurology has been taking over the last decade, 15 years or so, is not that there's an objective world out there that we take in and respond to so much as we have these patterns of neural behavior, trying to figure out what the hell is it that's out there. We don't know. We come up with some kind of guess. We is that a tree? You walk into it, okay, it's hard. This is how children learn as well. So we form a hypothesis about what's out there and test it. And it's called active inference, that we're effectively trying to infer what it is that is giving us this stimulus. Now, it's also true internally that we have all kinds of aches and pains and things. And again, we don't know what causes them. We try to infer by changing our behavior in one way or another what it is that's giving us this pain. Now, Lisa Feldman-Barrett has had very interesting things to say about the differences between feelings and emotions. And a feeling, for example, is literally some kind of pain or whatever it may be, but what causes it? How do I know how I should interpret this? And again, it's all about inferring what that cause is. So this is what I think is potentially missing from purely a computational level of circuitry. It's the trying to infer what's wrong with me right now. It's not clear to me that that's ever been programmed into anything that looks like ChatGPT or any AI.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to contradict you.
All right.
Oh, seriously, a large part of the research in machine learning is, similar to what you call active inference. In other words, it's about building probabilistic model of the data.
So for the outside or the inside?
The outside, model of the outside that include what we call latent variables, which are just explanations, causes for the data. So a lot of the models that people are working on that are not ChatGPT, but like very closely related, they are all about coming up with what are the causes of what I'm seeing. And of course, you need an internal language for this, like the language of these potential concepts that it can be causes. And there's a lot of research on these things, and there's been a lot of progress in the last few decades. And people make the connection with things like ChatGPT to try to figure out if it's doing something like this implicitly or not. We don't know. But what I'm saying is that the science of coming up with causal explanations, the computer doing it, not us, is well advanced and is not science fiction.
No, I'm not disputing any of that. It's the difference between the external looking, making sense of the world, or the internal embodiment. And I'm not saying that it's not possible in principle for AI to become conscious, but embodiment and having some kind of need to understand your own system. And in terms of life, that's very much in terms of the physical processes in the wetware.
I hate to be the person to call time on this. I'm so sorry. I hope that this has been food for thought, if nothing else. We've learned that so far consciousness seems to be considered from the perspective of computation, but also subjective experience, that modeling those subjective experiences is really critical, and that actually it might be possible that ChatGPT does care about how I feel. So on that note, could we please thank all of our fantastic speakers.